The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty town square of Cedar Falls as Margaret O'Brien clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. The autumn wind of 1847 carried with it the scent of dying leaves and something else, the bitter taste of desperation that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She stood before the courthouse steps, her chin raised in defiance despite the trembling in her hands, watching as men in fine coats discussed her fate as if she were livestock at market. $3, called out Samuel Hutchins, the town's most prominent merchant, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. $3 for the woman and her debts. Margaret felt her stomach drop, but she forced herself to remain standing. $3. That was all her life had come to worth in the eyes of these men. $3 for a woman who had once worn silk dresses and hosted dinner parties in the finest home in the county. $3 for someone who had lost everything when the war took her husband and left her drowning in debts she never knew existed. The auctioneer, a thin man with nervous hands, looked around the gathered crowd hopefully. Do I hear $4? $4 for Mrs. O'Brien and the assumption of her late husband's debts. Silence stretched across the square like a taut rope. Margaret scanned the faces before her, some sympathetic, others curious, many simply indifferent. These were people she had once considered friends and neighbors, people she had invited to her table and helped in their times of need. Now they watched her humiliation with the detached interest of spectators at a county fair. $3 going once, the auctioneer called, his voice echoing off the brick buildings that surrounded the square. Margaret's mind raced back to the morning 6 months ago when Sheriff Coleman had arrived at her door with papers she couldn't understand and debts she couldn't pay. Her husband Patrick had been dead for 2 years, killed at Buena Vista fighting for a country that now seemed eager to discard his widow. The debts, she learned, were gambling debts, money Patrick had borrowed and lost in card games she never knew he attended. Money borrowed against their home, their land, everything they owned. I can work, she had pleaded with the bank president. I can sew, I can cook, I can manage accounts. Please, just give me time. But time, it seemed, was a luxury she couldn't afford. The men in their pressed suits and polished shoes had smiled at her with cold sympathy and explained that the law was the law. Debts must be paid, and if she couldn't pay them, then she would be sold to someone who could. $3 going twice. The auctioneer's voice brought her back to the present moment. Margaret thought of her mother, who had died when Margaret was only 16, but who had taught her that a woman's dignity was the one thing that could never be taken away unless she surrendered herself. She thought of Patrick, who had promised her a life of comfort and security, never telling her about the demons that drove him to lose everything they had built together at card tables in the back rooms of saloons. A movement at the edge of the crowd caught her attention. A tall man stepped forward, his skin bronzed by years under the sun, his long black hair tied back with a leather cord. He wore buckskin pants and a simple cotton shirt with moccasins that made no sound as he walked across the packed earth of the square. Everything about him spoke of a different world, one that existed beyond the boundaries of this town, with its strict rules and suffocating propriety. The crowd parted slightly as he approached, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and unease. Margaret had never seen him before, but she recognized the wariness in the townspeople's eyes. This was a Choctaw man, one of the few who still lived in the area despite the government's attempts to force all the tribes westward. He stopped directly in front of the auctioneer's platform and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly across the square. $3. The auctioneer looked confused for a moment. Sir, the bidding is at $3. Do you wish to bid for? The Choctaw man shook his head slowly. I will pay the $3. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. This stranger, this man from a world she had been taught to fear and misunderstand, was offering to buy her debt, to take responsibility for her fate. She found herself studying his face, looking for some clue to his intentions. His features were strong and angular, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to hold depth she couldn't fathom. There was something in his expression, not cruelty or lust, as she might have expected, but rather a quiet intensity that both frightened and intrigued her. Going once to the gentleman, the auctioneer called out, though his use of the word gentleman for the Choctaw man was clearly reluctant. Margaret's legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to stand straighter. If this was to be her fate, if she was to be sold like a piece of property, then she would face it with whatever dignity she had left. She looked directly at the man who was about to purchase her debt, meeting his dark eyes with her own green ones. Going twice, the auctioneer's voice seemed to come from very far away. The Choctaw man never looked away from Margaret's face. In his gaze, she saw something unexpected, recognition, as if he understood something about her situation that the others in the crowd did not. It wasn't pity she saw there, which would have been unbearable, but rather a kind of acknowledgement of shared experience with loss and displacement. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through Margaret's bones. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded. Some lingered to whisper among themselves, no doubt already spreading gossip about the war widow who had been purchased by a Choctaw hunter for the price of a decent pair of boots. Margaret remained frozen in place, uncertain of what was expected of her now. The Choctaw man approached the auctioneer and reached into a leather pouch at his belt, counting out 3 silver dollars. Each coin clinked against the wooden table with the finality of a bell tolling. When the transaction was complete, he turned and walked toward Margaret. She braced herself for whatever was to come. Would he speak to her roughly, treat her as property now that he had bought her debt? Would he expect immediate submission, or worse? Her heart pounded in her chest as he stopped a respectful distance away from her. "My name is Ayana," he said quietly, using the Choctaw pronunciation that sounded like flowing water over stones. "I know this is difficult for you." Margaret was surprised by his gentleness, and even more surprised that he spoke English so clearly with only the slightest accent. She had expected broken speech, or perhaps no English at all. Her education, limited as it was for a woman of her time, had taught her little about the native peoples beyond fear and prejudice. She began, then stopped. What was she supposed to say? Thank you for purchasing my debt? Thank you for saving me from whatever fate might have awaited with someone less gentle? Ayana seemed to understand her confusion. "You are not my property," he said firmly. "The debt is paid, but you are free to make your own choices about what comes next." Margaret stared at him in bewilderment. "I don't understand." "Walk with me," he suggested, gesturing toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open fields and forest. "There is much to discuss, and this place—" He glanced around at the few remaining townspeople who were still watching them with undisguised curiosity. "This place is not good for such conversations." Margaret hesitated. Everything she had been taught told her not to trust this man, not to go anywhere alone with him. But what choice did she have? Her debt was paid, but she had no money, no home, no prospects. At least this man was offering her a choice, which was more than anyone else had done. "Very well," she said quietly. They walked in silence through the streets of Cedar Falls, past the houses where Margaret had once been a welcome guest, past the church where she had been married to Patrick in happier times, past the general store where she had once shopped freely instead of begging for credit. With each step, she felt herself moving further away from the life she had known and deeper into uncertainty. At the edge of town, where the road disappeared into a stand of oak and maple trees bright with autumn colors, Ayana finally stopped. He turned to face her, and Margaret was struck again by the intelligence in his dark eyes. "You said I was free to make my own choices," she said, finding her voice at last. "What choices do I have?" Ayana was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "You can return to town if you wish. Your debt is paid, so no one can force you into servitude. But you would still have no home, no money, no way to support yourself." Margaret nodded. This was the reality she had been trying to avoid thinking about. Even with her debt cleared, she was still a woman alone in a world that had little place for such creatures. "What else?" she asked. "You can come with me," Ayana said simply. "I have a cabin in the woods about a day's walk from here. You could stay there while you decide what you want to do with your life." Margaret felt her breath catch. And what would you expect in return? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Margaret had heard stories about what happened to white women who went to live among the Indians, though she suspected most of those stories were exaggerated or entirely false. Still, she needed to know what this man expected from her. Ayana's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. "I would expect you to help with cooking and mending as any member of a household would. Nothing more, unless you chose it freely." "Why?" The question burst out of Margaret before she could stop it. "Why would you help me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why would you spend your money to pay my debt? and then offer me shelter. For the first time since she had seen him, Ayana looked away from her face. He stared out at the forest, where the afternoon light was beginning to slant through the trees in golden beams. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. 3 years ago, soldiers came to my village, he said quietly. They said we had to leave, go west in new territory. Most of my people went. Some fought and died. I left too, at first. But the new place, he shook his head. It was not home, so I came back alone. I live quietly, cause no trouble, hunt and trade for what I need. Margaret waited, sensing there was more to his story. Before the soldiers came, Ayana continued. I had a wife. Her name was Tallulah. She was pregnant with our first child. His voice grew even quieter. She got sick on the journey west. The white doctors would not treat her because she was Choctaw. She died, and our baby with her. Margaret felt a sharp pain in her chest, recognizing the ache of devastating loss. I'm sorry, she whispered. Ayana looked at her again. Today, watching you stand there while those men decided your fate, I saw something I recognized. I saw someone who had lost everything through no fault of their own, someone who was being punished for other people's choices and prejudices. I cannot walk away from that. The sincerity in his voice moved Margaret in a way she hadn't expected. This man understood loss, understood what it meant to be cast adrift in a world that no longer had a place for you. But more than that, he was offering her something no one else had, genuine choice, without coercion or expectation. I won't kneel to you, she said suddenly, the words coming out stronger than she felt. I won't be your servant or your property, no matter what the law says about who owns my debt. Ayana smiled for the first time since she had seen him, and the expression transformed his entire face. I would not want you to, he said. A person's spirit cannot be bought or sold, only given freely or kept whole. Margaret looked back toward the town, where smoke was beginning to rise from chimneys as families prepared their evening meals in warm homes she would never again be welcome in. Then she looked at the forest path that disappeared into shadows and uncertainty, but also into possibility. If I come with you, she said slowly, it would only be temporary, until I can figure out what to do next. Of course, Ayana agreed. You are free to leave whenever you choose. Margaret took a deep breath, tasting the sharp autumn air and the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Behind her lay a life that had been destroyed by forces beyond her control. Ahead lay the unknown, guided by a man who was himself an outcast, but who had shown her more kindness in one afternoon than her supposed friends and neighbors had shown her in months of struggle. Then, I choose to come with you, she said, and felt something inside her chest, something that had been clenched tight with fear and desperation, begin to loosen just slightly. Ayana nodded once, then turned toward the forest path. We should go then. It will be dark soon, and the first part of the journey is easier in daylight. As they walked into the forest, Margaret felt the weight of the town's eyes finally lift from her shoulders. Each step took her further from the life she had known, but also further from the shame and helplessness that had nearly consumed her. She was still a woman with nothing to her name, but the clothes on her back, still someone whose future was entirely uncertain. But for the first time in months, she was a woman making her own choices about her fate. The path wound through trees that were brilliant with red and gold leaves, their branches creating a canopy overhead that filtered the afternoon light into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. Margaret's feet, accustomed to wooden floors and paved streets, found the uneven earth challenging, but she pressed on without complaint. Behind them, the sound of the town gradually faded away until all she could hear was the rustle of leaves in the wind and the soft sound of their footsteps on the forest floor. Ahead, following the steady figure of the Choctaw man who had bought her freedom for $3 silver, Margaret O'Brien walked into whatever came next, carrying with her only her determination to remain unbroken by whatever trials awaited. The forest path grew narrower as they traveled deeper into the wilderness, winding between towering oak trees whose branches formed a canopy so thick that twilight seemed to come earlier here than in the open spaces around town. Margaret's leather shoes, once fine enough for church services and social calls, were never meant for such terrain. Rocks and roots caught at her feet with every step, and she could feel blisters beginning to form where the smooth soles slipped against her stockings. Ayana moved ahead of her with the fluid grace of someone who had walked these paths since childhood. His moccasins made no sound on the fallen leaves, while her every step seemed to announce their presence to any creature within miles. She tried to match his quiet movements, but found herself stumbling repeatedly, each misstep sending small avalanches of stones skittering down the hillsides they traversed. "I'm sorry," she whispered after a particularly loud stumble that sent her grabbing for a tree branch to keep from falling. "I'm not used to walking in forests." Ayanna stopped and turned back to her, his expression patient rather than annoyed. "The land speaks differently here than in town," he said quietly. "It takes time to learn its language." He waited while she caught her breath, studying her face in the fading light. Margaret realized he was assessing whether she would be able to continue the journey. The thought of admitting defeat so early, of having to return to Cedar Falls in failure, sent a surge of determination through her tired muscles. "I can keep going," she said firmly. Ayanna nodded, but instead of immediately resuming their walk, he knelt and began gathering small branches and dried moss from the forest floor. "We will make camp soon," he said. "It is better to stop while we can still see to gather wood for a fire." Margaret watched him work, noting the efficiency of his movements and the careful way he selected only the driest wood. She realized he was preparing to spend the night in the open forest, something that had never occurred to her. In her world, travel meant coaches and inns, planned stops with prepared accommodations. The idea of sleeping outdoors filled her with anxiety, but she pushed the feeling down. This was the choice she had made, and she would see it through. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked. Ayanna looked up from his wood gathering with what might have been surprise. "You could look for flat stones, ones that might be used to circle a fire pit." Margaret began searching among the fallen leaves, grateful to have a useful task. The stones were harder to find than she had expected, and she had to dig through layers of decomposing foliage to uncover ones of the right size and shape. Her hands, soft from years of indoor work, quickly became scratched and dirty, but she continued to work without complaint. As she searched, she became aware of the sound around them. The forest was not quiet, as she had always imagined. Instead, it was filled with a symphony of small noises, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the calls of birds she couldn't identify, the whisper of wind through leaves, and the distant sound of flowing water. Each sound made her start slightly, her mind immediately imagining dangers that might lurk in the growing darkness. "There's a stream about 50 yards that way," Ayanna said, pointing deeper into the forest. "The sound carries well in this valley." "Will we have fresh water then?" Margaret asked, realizing that this was another concern she had never had to consider before. "Yes, and we will be able to wash before sleep," Ayanna replied. "The stream is clean and cold." By the time they had gathered enough wood and stones, full darkness had settled over the forest. Ayanna arranged the stones in a careful circle and began building a small fire with the methodical patience of someone who had performed this task countless times. Margaret watched as he used flint and steel to create sparks, coaxing them in a flame with small pieces of dry moss and bark. The fire caught and grew, casting dancing shadows on the trees around them and creating a small circle of warmth and light in a vast darkness. Margaret had never realized how comforting firelight could be, or how small and vulnerable two people could feel surrounded by the wilderness. "Sit." Ayanna gestured to a fallen log he had dragged near the fire. "You must be tired." Margaret lowered herself onto the log gratefully, only then realizing how exhausted she was. The day had begun with her standing on the courthouse steps, facing the humiliation of being sold to pay her debts. Now she was sitting beside a campfire in the middle of a forest, sharing the space with a man she had known for less than 12 hours. The transformation seemed too dramatic to be real. Ayanna reached into the leather pack he carried and withdrew dried meat and flat cakes that looked like they might be made from corn. He offered half of everything to Margaret without comment. "Thank you," she said, accepting the food. She bit into the meat cautiously and found it surprisingly flavorful, seasoned with herbs and spices she couldn't identify. The corn cakes were dense and filling, with a slightly sweet taste that satisfied hunger she hadn't realized she felt. They ate in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the forest providing a peaceful backdrop. Margaret found herself studying Ayanna's face in the firelight, noting the way the flames highlighted the strong bones of his cheeks and the thoughtful expression in his dark eyes. There was something calming about his presence, a sense of competence and self-possession that made her feel safer than she had felt in months. "How long have you lived alone in the forest?" she asked eventually. 2 years, Ayanna replied. "Since I returned from the Western Territory." "Don't you get lonely?" Ayanna considered this question for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes, but loneliness is different from being alone. In town, surrounded by people who see me only as what they fear I might be, I was more lonely than I am here among the trees and animals who accept me as I am." Margaret understood this distinction more than she might have a few days earlier. The months following Patrick's death had been filled with social visits and concerned neighbors, but she had never felt more isolated. The sympathy of others had gradually turned to impatience as her situation failed to improve, and eventually to embarrassment at being associated with someone who couldn't manage her affairs properly. "I think I understand," she said quietly. "Tell me about your husband," Ayanna said. "What was he like before the war?" Margaret was quiet for so long that Ayanna probably thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and uncertain, as if she was trying to remember a dream that was already fading. "Patrick was charming," she said slowly. "He had a way of making everyone in a room feel like they were the most important person there. He could tell stories that had people laughing until their sides hurt, and he remembered everyone's birthday and anniversary. He brought me flowers every Friday for 2 years, even after we were married." She paused, staring into the fire as she tried to reconcile those memories with what she had learned about her husband after his death. "But there were things I didn't know," she continued. "Things he hid from me. The gambling, the debts, the men he owed money to. He kept that part of his life completely separate from our marriage. I thought I knew him completely, but it turned out I only knew the parts he wanted me to see." "People contain many different selves," Ayanna observed. "Sometimes even they do not know which self will emerge in different circumstances." "Did you know your wife completely?" Margaret asked, then immediately wondered if the question was too personal. Ayanna smiled, but it was a sad expression. "I thought I did, but she died so young that we never had the chance to discover all the people we might have become together. In some ways, I am still married to who she was at 20, while I have continued to change and grow older." They fell silent again, both lost in memories of people who existed now only in their thoughts. The fire settled lower, requiring Ayanna to add more wood to keep it burning steadily. The night sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder. The hoot of an owl somewhere in the distance, the rustle of leaves as some night creature moved through the underbrush. "Are there dangerous animals in these woods?" Margaret asked, realizing she had no idea what threats the wilderness might hold. "Some," Ayanna acknowledged. "Black bears, though they will usually avoid humans if they hear us coming. Wild boars can be aggressive if cornered. There are rattlesnakes, but they're less active now that the weather is turning cooler." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. In town, the most dangerous creatures she had encountered were the occasional rabid dog or aggressive drunk. The idea of bears and snakes sharing the forest with them made her acutely aware of how helpless she would be if anything went wrong. "The fire will keep most animals away," Ayanna added, apparently noticing her concern. "And I'm a light sleeper. You'll be safe." His certainty was comforting, but Margaret still found herself scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, imagining yellow eyes watching them from the shadows. Every sound made her start slightly, though she tried to hide her nervousness. "Tomorrow, when we reach your cabin," she said, "what will be expected of me?" Ayanna poked at the fire with a long stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky. "Nothing will be expected that you do not choose to give," he said. "The cabin is small, but comfortable. There's a garden that still has late vegetables, and a root cellar where food is stored for winter. There are chickens and a goat that gives milk." "It sounds like you live well," Margaret observed. "Well enough," Ayanna agreed. "I trade furs and meat in town for things I cannot make myself: cloth, metal tools, coffee when I can afford it. It is a simple life, but it is free." Margaret tried to imagine what such a life would be like. She had never lived anywhere without servants or at least household help. The idea of caring for chickens and milking a goat was both daunting and oddly appealing. At least it would be work that belonged to her, rather than charity from others. "I should tell you," she said hesitantly, "I don't know very much about keeping house. Patrick and I always had servants, and before marriage I lived with my aunt who managed everything. I can sew reasonably well, and I know how to plan meals, but I've never actually cooked very much or cleaned or any of the things a woman should know how to do. Ayana looked at her with an expression that might have been amusement. You think that being useful requires you to already know how to do everything? Well, no, but learning is part of living, he said simply. If you want to learn how to care for chickens, you will watch how it is done and practice until you understand. If you want to learn to cook over a fire instead of a stove, you will make mistakes until you discover what works. His matter-of-fact acceptance of her inexperience was something Margaret had never encountered before. In her world, women were expected to arrive at marriage already competent in domestic arts, and any gaps in knowledge were sources of shame rather than opportunities for growth. What if I'm terrible at it? She asked. Then you'll be terrible at it until you improve, Ayana replied with what was definitely amusement now. The chickens will not judge you harshly for clumsy handling, and burned food is still more filling than no food at all. Despite her anxiety, Margaret found herself smiling at his practical attitude. There was something liberating about the idea that she could be bad at things without it being a moral failing or a source of social disgrace. As the night grew deeper and the fire settled in its steady coals, Ayana showed her how to arrange pine boughs and fallen leaves into a relatively comfortable sleeping area. He gave her his blanket and settled himself on the other side of the fire with only his leather jacket for warmth. I can't take your blanket, Margaret protested. You'll be cold. I'm used to sleeping outdoors, Ayana said, and the fire will keep us both warm enough. Margaret wrapped herself in the blanket, which smelled like wood smoke and pine needles, and lay down on the makeshift bed. The ground was harder than anything she had ever tried to sleep on, and every sound in the forest made her eyes snap open with alertness. But gradually, the warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of Ayana's breathing helped her relax. Just as she was beginning to drift towards sleep, she heard him speak softly from across the fire. Margaret, yes. Thank you for trusting me enough to come this far. Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Trust was perhaps too strong a word for what had brought her this far. Desperation might be more accurate, or simply the lack of any better alternative. But as she lay there in the wilderness, protected by the fire and the steady presence of this man who had bought her freedom for $3 silver, she realized that trust might indeed be beginning to grow. Thank you for offering me a choice, she replied quietly. The fire crackled softly between them as the forest settled into the deep quiet of full night. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, but feeling for the first time in months that she was moving towards something rather than simply running away from what she had lost. Margaret woke to the sound of birds singing and the smell of wood smoke mixed with something that made her stomach growl with hunger. The sun was already well above the horizon, streaming through the canopy of leaves in golden beams that made the whole forest seem to glow. She sat up slowly, her body stiff and sore from sleeping on the ground, and saw Ayana crouched beside the fire, tending something that sizzled in a small iron pan. Good morning, he said without looking up from his cooking. I hope you slept well. Margaret stretched carefully, trying to work out the kinks in her back and shoulders. Better than I expected, she admitted, which was true. After the initial discomfort of sleeping outdoors, she had fallen into surprisingly deep sleep, lulled by the sounds of the forest and the security of the fire. What is that wonderful smell? She asked, moving closer to the fire. Fish, Ayana replied, turning the golden brown fillets carefully with a wooden spatula he had carved himself. The stream is good trout, and they're easy to catch if you know where to look. Margaret realized that while she had been sleeping, Ayana had been up catching and cleaning their breakfast. She felt a flush of embarrassment at her own uselessness. I'm sorry I didn't help. You should have woken me. Ayana glanced at her with that same patient expression she was beginning to recognize. You needed rest more than I needed help. And fishing is easier alone in the early morning when the water is still. He served the fish on flat pieces of bark, along with the remaining corn cakes from the previous evening. Margaret had never eaten fish cooked over an open fire before, and she was surprised by how delicious it was, crispy on the outside and flaky within, with a smoky flavor that no kitchen stove could have provided. After they had eaten and Ayana had carefully extinguished the fire, scattering the ashes and replacing the stones so that no trace of their campsite remained, they resumed their journey. The path climbed steadily upward through the morning, winding around rock outcroppings and through groves of trees that seemed to grow larger and more ancient with each mile they traveled. Margaret's legs quickly began to ache from the unaccustomed exercise, but she was determined not to complain. She focused on placing her feet carefully and tried to move as quietly as Ayanna did, though she was still far from achieving his silent grace. Gradually, she began to notice details she had missed the day before. The way certain plants grew only in specific types of soil, the tracks of various animals in the soft earth beside the path, the subtle signs that indicated water or shelter nearby. "How much farther?" she asked during one of their brief rest stops, trying to keep any note of whining out of her voice. "We will reach the cabin by midday," Ayanna replied. He studied her face, noting the flush of exertion and the way she favored her left foot where a blister had formed. "Are you managing all right?" "I'm fine," Margaret said quickly, then added more honestly, "My feet hurt, but I can keep going." Ayanna nodded and reached into his pack, withdrawing a small pouch of what looked like dried leaves. "Chew these," he said, offering her a small handful. "They will help with the pain and give you energy." Margaret looked dubiously at the dried leaves, wondering if accepting them was wise. But her feet were truly painful, and she was beginning to feel lightheaded from the unaccustomed exertion. She put the leaves in her mouth and began to chew, finding them bitter but not unpleasant. Within a few minutes, she felt a subtle change in her energy level, and the throbbing in her feet seemed to diminish. Whatever the plant was, it worked better than anything she might have found in a doctor's office in town. "What is it?" she asked. "Willow bark and other things," Ayanna said. "My grandmother taught me which plants help with pain and fatigue." As they continued walking, Margaret found herself thinking about the differences between Ayanna's knowledge and her own education. She had been taught to read and write, to perform simple arithmetic, to play piano, and speak a little French. She could recite poetry and knew the proper forms of address for various social situations. But none of those skills would help her catch fish or identify healing plants or navigate through wilderness. "Your grandmother," she said, "did she teach you many things about plants and medicine?" Ayanna was quiet for a few steps before answering. "She was a medicine woman for our tribe. She knew hundreds of plants, and their uses could set broken bones and deliver babies, could prepare the body for burial, and help souls find their way to the next world. She taught me as much as she could before." "Before what?" Margaret asked gently. "Before the soldiers came and said such knowledge was heathen superstition that had no place in civilized territory." The bitterness in his voice was barely contained, and Margaret felt a flush of shame for the assumptions her people had made about his. She had been taught that Indians were savage and ignorant, but everything she had seen of Ayanna suggested knowledge and skills far more practical and immediately useful than anything she had learned in her formal education. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Ayanna glanced at her, his expression softening. "You did not make those decisions, but I believe the things I was told without questioning them. I never tried to learn if they were true." "Most people believe what they are taught," Ayanna observed. "It takes courage to question the stories your own people tell about others." They walked in comfortable silence after that, the path continuing to climb through increasingly dense forest. Margaret found herself falling into a rhythm of walking that was less tiring than her initial approach, and the pain medicine was helping her ignore the worst of her discomfort. She began to notice the beauty of the forest around them, the way sunlight filtered through leaves in constantly shifting patterns, the incredible variety of plants and trees, the sense of peace that came from being surrounded by growing things that had never been touched by human plans or ambitions. Just before midday, as Ayanna had predicted, they crested a small hill, and Margaret got her first view of his cabin. It sat in a natural clearing beside a stream that tumbled down from higher ground in a series of small waterfalls. The building itself was larger than she had expected, built of logs that had weathered to a silvery gray, with a stone chimney from which smoke was rising in a thin, straight line. "Someone is there," Margaret observed, feeling suddenly nervous. "I left a fire banked in the stove," Ayanna explained. "It is easier to restart a fire than to build a new one from nothing." As they approached the cabin, Margaret could see that it was surrounded by evidence of careful habitation. There was a vegetable garden, mostly harvested but still showing the neat rows where crops had grown. A chicken coop sat near the cabin, and she could hear the soft murmuring of the birds inside. A goat was tethered in a small pasture, and it looked up at their approach with intelligent brown eyes. The cabin itself was simply but solidly built, with a covered porch that faced the stream and windows that had been fitted with actual glass rather than the oil paper or animal hide she might have expected. The door was painted a deep blue that had faded slightly, but still provided a welcoming splash of color against the gray logs. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, and meant it. The cabin had a quality of belonging in its setting that made it seem like a natural part of the landscape, rather than an intrusion upon it. Ayanna looked pleased by her reaction. "It took me most of the first year to build it properly. I wanted it to be solid enough to last through many winters." He led her up the steps to the porch, where several chairs sat facing the stream, and opened the door to invite her inside. Margaret stepped across the threshold into what would be her new home, at least temporarily, and found herself in a single large room that served as kitchen, living area, and dining space. The cabin was simply furnished, but comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking crane that could swing pots over the flames. Against another wall stood a wooden table and 2 chairs, both carved by hand with simple but elegant lines. Shelves held dishes, cooking implements, and a collection of books that surprised Margaret with both their number and variety. A ladder led up to what was obviously a sleeping loft, while a curtained alcove near the fireplace contained what looked like a bed. The floors were made of wide planks that had been sanded smooth and left natural, covered here and there with woven rugs and patterns Margaret didn't recognize but found beautiful. "The loft is yours if you want privacy," Ayanna said, noting the direction of her gaze. "I usually sleep down here by the fire." Margaret climbed the ladder carefully and found herself in a cozy space under the eaves of the roof. Someone had built a proper bed frame and fitted it with a mattress that, while not as soft as what she was accustomed to, was far more comfortable than the forest floor. There were pegs on the walls for hanging clothes, a small table that could serve as a desk, and a window that looked out over the stream and the forest beyond. "This is lovely," she called down to Ayanna. "Did you build the furniture yourself?" "Most of it," he replied. "I am better with wood than with many other things." Margaret climbed back down the ladder and wandered around the main room, examining the details of Ayanna's solitary life. The books were an eclectic collection, some in English, some in what she assumed was Choctaw, others in languages she couldn't identify. There were volumes on medicine and plants, books of poetry, treatises on farming and animal husbandry, and several novels that she recognized as popular fiction from recent years. "You're quite a reader," she observed. "Books are company when you live alone," Ayanna said, "and there's always something new to learn." On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, Margaret noticed several carved figures that appeared to be animals: a bear, an eagle, a turtle. They were beautifully crafted, with flowing lines that captured the essence of each creature with remarkable economy of detail. "Did you carve these?" Ayanna nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "It gives my hands something to do during the long winter evenings." Margaret picked up the eagle, running her fingers over the smooth wood and marveling at the skill required to create something so lifelike from a simple piece of timber. "They're wonderful. You have real talent." She meant the compliment sincerely, but she could see that Ayanna was uncomfortable with praise. He turned away and began building up the fire in the stove, adding wood with the same methodical patience she had observed the night before. "Are you hungry?" he asked, clearly changing the subject. "There's soup that has been simmering since yesterday, and fresh bread that I baked before I left for town." Margaret realized that she was indeed hungry, despite the fish they had eaten that morning. The long walk and mountain air had given her an appetite unlike anything she had experienced in months of worry and stress in town. Ayanna ladled soup into wooden bowls and sliced bread that was dense and dark, nothing like the white bread she was accustomed to, but far more flavorful. The soup was thick with vegetables and what tasted like venison, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but that made her mouth water. They sat at the table by the window, eating in comfortable silence while Margaret watched the stream outside. The water moved constantly, but peacefully, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted with the movement of clouds across the sun. She could see fish jumping occasionally, sending rings across the surface of deeper pools. "It's very peaceful here," she said eventually. "Yes," Ayanna agreed. "Sometimes I go for days without hearing any human voice, but my own. Doesn't that drive you to distraction? Ayana smiled. In town, I found that most human voices were saying things I did not need to hear. Here, when I speak, it is because I have something I actually want to say. Margaret considered this as she finished her soup. In her former life, she had been surrounded by constant conversation, social visits, dinner parties, church gatherings where people talk for the sake of talking rather than because they had anything meaningful to communicate. The idea of speaking only when she had something worth saying was novel and appealing. After lunch, Ayana showed her around the practical aspects of her new temporary home. The chicken coop housed 6 hens and a rooster, all of which seemed well cared for and productive. The goat was named Bella and was surprisingly friendly, allowing Margaret to scratch behind her ears while Ayana explained the routine of milking and feeding. The garden still contained late squash, turnips, and onions that hadn't yet been harvested, along with herbs that could be dried for winter use. A root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin held preserved meat, dried corn, beans, and other supplies that would last through the cold months. You're very well prepared for winter, Margaret observed. Living alone, you learn to think ahead, Ayana replied. If something goes wrong, and you cannot get to town for weeks or months, you must have everything you need to survive. The practicality of his preparations impressed Margaret. In town, she had lived day to day, assuming that food would always be available at the market and that other people would provide services she couldn't perform herself. The idea of being completely self-sufficient was both daunting and oddly appealing. As afternoon turned toward evening, Ayana began preparing dinner. More of the soup from lunch, along with vegetables roasted over the fire and cornbread baked in a heavy iron pot. Margaret watched his every movement, trying to learn techniques she would need if she was going to contribute to the household work. "Can you show me how to do that?" she asked as he skillfully turned to roasting vegetables with a long fork. "Of course," Ayana said, handing her the fork. "The important thing is to keep them moving so they cook evenly." Margaret took the implement awkwardly, trying to mimic his confident movements. The vegetables immediately began to stick and burn on one side while remaining raw on the other. "Like this," Ayana said patiently, guiding her hand with his own to show her the proper technique. Margaret felt a flutter of awareness at the contact, surprised by the gentleness of his touch and the way his hands, calloused from outdoor work, were nevertheless careful and controlled. She found herself focusing more on the warmth of his fingers than on the vegetables they were supposed to be cooking. "There," he said, stepping back once she had gotten the hang of the movement. "You learn quickly." Margaret felt a flush of pride at the simple compliment. When was the last time anyone had praised her for learning something new rather than criticized her for not already knowing it? As darkness fell outside, and they settled into chairs by the fire after dinner, Margaret found herself feeling more relaxed than she had in months. The cabin was warm and comfortable, filled with the scents of wood smoke and cooking food. Outside, she could hear the gentle sound of the stream and the settling noises of the chickens as they roost for the night. "What will you do tomorrow?" she asked Ayana, who was working on another carving, this one appearing to be a deer. "Check the snares I set before I left for town," he replied, his hands moving steadily as he shaped the wood. "Repair the fence around the garden where something has been getting in. Cut more firewood for winter. Can I help with any of those things?" Ayana looked up from his carving, studying her face in the firelight. "If you want to learn, I can teach you. But you do not have to earn your place here, Margaret. You are welcome to rest and recover from everything that has happened to you." Margaret shook her head. "I want to be useful. I want to learn how to do things that matter." "Then tomorrow we will begin," Ayana said simply, and returned to his carving. Margaret watched his skilled hands shape the wood, turning a rough block into something graceful and alive. She thought about the strange turns her life had taken, from comfortable wife to destitute widow to what? She didn't know what she was becoming, but for the first time since Patrick's death, she felt curious about her future rather than simply afraid of it. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the forest, its voice echoing through the darkness. Margaret pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders and settled deeper in her chair, feeling safer and more at peace than she had in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new learning, but tonight she was warm and fed and protected in the company of a man who had shown her more kindness than anyone she had known in her former life. The fire crackled softly between them as the night deepened around the cabin, and Margaret O'Brien began to imagine, for the first time in a very long time, that her story might have a happier ending than she had dared to hope. Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of movement downstairs, followed by the gentle closing of the cabin door. Through the small window above her bed, she could see the first pale light of morning beginning to filter through the forest canopy. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of the wilderness waking around her. Birds beginning their morning songs, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the constant murmur of the stream that ran beside the cabin. After dressing quickly in the same clothes she had worn for 3 days now, she climbed down the ladder to find that Ayanna had left the fire burning low and had set aside some of the cornbread from the previous evening. A note written in careful English script lay beside the bread. Gone to check snares. Back by full sunrise. Make yourself at home. Margaret smiled at the thoughtfulness of leaving her a message, though she wondered how many people Ayanna had occasion to write notes for in his solitary life. She added wood to the fire and put the kettle on to boil, then stepped outside to get her first real look at Ayanna's property in daylight. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. The cabin sat in a natural clearing that had been expanded and carefully maintained, surrounded by towering trees that formed a protective circle around the small homestead. The stream that provided water was larger than it had seemed in yesterday's fading light, wide enough to support the fish Ayanna caught, and fast enough to remain clean and cold even in summer. Margaret walked down to the water's edge and knelt carefully, cupping the cold water in her hands to splash on her face. The shock of the temperature made her gasp, but it was refreshing in a way that the tepid wash basin water she was accustomed to had never been. She could see fish moving in the deeper pools, dark shadows that darted quickly away when her movement sent ripples across the surface. "They're more easily caught in the early morning," came Ayanna's voice from behind her. Margaret turned to see him emerging from the forest, carrying 2 rabbits and what appeared to be several kinds of plants he had gathered along the way. His step was quiet and confident, his movements economical and purposeful in a way that spoke of years spent moving through wilderness. "I hope I didn't disturb them too much," Margaret said, standing and brushing water from her hands. "Fish forgive easily," Ayanna replied with what she was beginning to recognize as his gentle humor. "And there are always more pools upstream." He showed her the results of his morning's work. The 2 rabbits would provide fresh meat for several days, while the plants included late berries, roots that could be dried for winter storage, and herbs for cooking and medicine. Margaret watched as he quickly and efficiently cleaned the rabbits, working with practiced movements that wasted nothing and left the area around the cabin as clean as he had found it. "Could you teach me to do that?" she asked, though the idea of handling dead animals was somewhat daunting. "If you want to learn," Ayanna said, "it is useful knowledge for anyone who might need to provide for themselves." Margaret nodded, though she felt queasy watching the careful process of skinning and preparing the meat. In her former life, meat had appeared on her table already cooked and elegantly presented, with no reminder of its origins. The reality of obtaining food directly from its source was sobering. "Everything here requires more work than I'm used to," she admitted. "Different work," Ayanna corrected gently. "In town, you had to manage servants, plan meals, oversee household accounts, maintain social relationships. That is also work, just work of a different kind." Margaret hadn't thought of her previous life as involving work. It had simply been the way things were done in the world she knew. But as she considered Ayanna's words, she realized that managing a household, even with servants, had required skills and constant attention. The problem was that those skills were useless in her current situation. "The work here is more immediate," she said slowly. "If I make a mistake with the fire, we don't eat. If I handle the chickens wrong, we don't get eggs." "Yes," Ayanna agreed. "But also if you do things well, you can see the results immediately. The fire burns, the chickens lay eggs, the garden grows. There's satisfaction in work where you can see the direct connection between effort and result." After breakfast, Ayanna began teaching Margaret the daily routine that kept the small homestead functioning. The chickens needed to be fed and watered, their coop cleaned, and eggs collected. The goat required milking, fresh bedding, and access to the small pasture where she could graze. Margaret approached the chickens nervously, having never been closer to live poultry than the occasional glimpse of delivery wagons in town. The birds seemed impossibly large and unpredictable, moving with sudden, jerky motions that made her jump. When she tried to collect eggs from the nesting boxes, the hens squawked and fluttered in apparent outrage at her clumsy intrusion. "They sense your fear," Ayanna observed, watching her fumbling attempts. "Move slowly and confidently, as if you have every right to be there." "But I don't have any right to be there," Margaret protested as a particularly aggressive hen pecked at her hand. "These are their eggs. You provide them with food, shelter, and protection from predators," Ayanna pointed out. "In exchange, they share some of their eggs. It is a fair trade, but you must behave like a partner in the agreement, not like a thief." Margaret tried to approach the task with more confidence, moving deliberately and speaking to the hens in a calm voice as she had seen Ayanna do. Gradually, the birds seemed to accept her presence, though they continued to watch her with suspicious eyes. Milking Bella the goat proved even more challenging. The animal was patient with Margaret's inexperienced hands, but the rhythm required to actually extract milk was completely beyond her abilities. After several frustrating minutes that produced more foam than milk, she sat back on her heels with a sigh of defeat. "I'm hopeless at this," she said. "You have been doing this for exactly 15 minutes, Ayanna pointed out. "I spent 3 weeks learning to milk properly when I first got Bella. Even then, she would often refuse to cooperate if my mood was wrong or my hands were too cold." He demonstrated the proper technique again, his movements steady and rhythmic as Bella stood peacefully under his ministrations. "The important thing is to develop a relationship with the animal. She needs to trust you before she will let you take her milk." Margaret tried again, focusing on remaining calm and gentle rather than simply trying to force the process. This time, she managed to extract a small but steady stream of milk, though nothing like the quantity Ayanna could achieve. "Better," he said approvingly. "With practice, it will become natural." The morning's lessons continued with instruction in tending the fire, both for cooking and for warmth. Margaret had to learn how different types of wood burned, some fast and hot for quick cooking, others slow and steady for maintaining heat through the night. She learned to bank coals so that a fire could be easily restarted, and how to adjust the cooking temperature by raising or lowering pots on the crane that swung over the flames. Each task seemed simple when she watched Ayanna perform it, but proved frustratingly difficult when she tried to do it herself. Her hands were soft and used to the physical demands of outdoor work, and she found herself struggling with tasks that required both strength and finesse. By midday, her back ached from bending over unfamiliar tasks, and her hands were scratched and dirty from handling rough tools and stubborn animals. "I feel like a child learning to walk," she admitted as they sat down to a lunch of bread, cheese made from Bella's milk, and the berries Ayanna had gathered that morning. "In some ways, you are," Ayanna said matter-of-factly. "You are learning to live in a completely different way than you have ever lived before. It would be strange if it was easy. How long did it take you to learn all of this?" Margaret asked. Ayanna considered the question while he carved slices from a hard cheese that had been aged in the root cellar. "I grew up doing many of these tasks, but living completely alone required learning new skills. The first year was very difficult. I made many mistakes, burned food, lost chickens to predators, nearly froze because I did not prepare enough firewood for winter." "What kept you going?" "Stubbornness, mostly," Ayanna said with a slight smile. "And the knowledge that going back to the reservation would mean accepting a life that was not really living." Margaret understood that feeling of preferring uncertainty to a situation that offered safety, but no real hope for happiness or fulfillment. Her choice to leave town with Ayanna had been driven by similar reasoning. Better to risk the unknown than to accept charity and pity from people who would never again see her as an equal. After lunch, Ayanna showed her the vegetable garden, explaining which plants were ready for harvest and how to prepare them for winter storage. The late squash were enormous, their thick skins promising months of stored nutrition. Turnips and onions needed to be dug carefully to avoid damage, then stored in specific conditions in the root cellar. Margaret found the work of harvesting deeply satisfying in a way that surprised her. Each vegetable represented the successful completion of a cycle that had begun with seeds planted in spring, tended through the growing season, and now brought to fruition. The connection between effort and result that Ayanna had mentioned was immediately apparent. These vegetables existed because he had planned, planted, weeded, and watered throughout the year. In town, she said, pulling a particularly large turnip from the earth, I never thought about where food came from. It just appeared at the market or was delivered to the kitchen. Most people live that way, Ayana observed. But there is something lost when you are so disconnected from the sources of what keeps you alive. Margaret nodded, understanding now what he meant. Holding food that she had helped harvest, she felt a connection to the earth and the seasons that she had never experienced before. Even her simple contribution to the work gave her a sense of participation in the cycle of life that was both humbling and empowering. As the afternoon progressed, Ayana began teaching her about the plants that grew wild around the cabin, which ones were edible, which had medicinal properties, and which should be avoided entirely. He showed her how to identify herbs by their smell and texture, how to harvest them without damaging the plant's ability to regrow, and how to prepare them for various uses. This knowledge was once common among all people, he explained as they gathered late mushrooms that grew on fallen logs. Everyone knew which plants could heal and which could harm, which roots could be eaten when other food was scarce, which leaves could be used to treat wounds. Why did people stop learning these things? Margaret asked. In towns and cities, it became easier to buy what you needed from specialists, doctors, pharmacists, grocers. People traded knowledge for convenience, not realizing what they were giving up. Margaret thought about her own education, which had focused on social accomplishments rather than practical knowledge. She could play piano and speak French, but she couldn't identify a single edible plant or treat even minor ailments without consulting a doctor. The realization made her feel both ignorant and determined to learn better. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees as they made their way back to the cabin, their baskets full of the day's harvest. Margaret felt tired but accomplished, her body pleasantly weary from physical work in a way that was entirely different from the mental fatigue she had known in her previous life. Tomorrow, Ayana said as they sorted vegetables on the cabin's porch, I will show you how to preserve meat by smoking and how to prepare some of these plants for winter storage. Will you also show me more about fishing? Margaret asked. I'd like to be able to contribute to getting our food, not just preparing it. Ayana looked pleased by her question. Fishing requires patience and quiet observation. It is good practice for understanding how to move in harmony with the natural world instead of always fighting against it. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Margaret worked on mending a tear in one of Ayana's shirts while he continued carving the deer that was slowly taking shape in his hands. The domestic tranquility of the scene struck her as almost dreamlike. Just weeks ago, she had been facing destitution and social disgrace, and now she was sitting in a warm cabin, learning skills that connected her directly to her own survival. Ayana, she said quietly, not looking up from her sewing, I want you to know that I'm grateful for what you've done. Not just paying my debt, but showing me that there are other ways to live. You are giving me something as well, Ayana replied. It has been a long time since I shared my home with someone who wanted to learn rather than simply take. Margaret looked up at him, surprised by his words. What am I giving you? Ayana was quiet for a moment, concentrating on a particularly delicate detail of the carving. Purpose, perhaps, or simply the reminder that knowledge is meant to be shared, not hoarded. They worked together in comfortable silence as the fire settled into glowing coals, and the sounds of the forest night began outside the cabin walls. Margaret found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this place, how losing everything she thought she valued had led her to discover capabilities and satisfactions she had never known she possessed. The woman who had stood on the courthouse steps being auctioned to pay her debts seemed like a different person entirely from the woman who now sat confidently beside a fire she had learned to tend, wearing clothes that carried the honest smell of outdoor work, her hands marked by useful labor instead of soft from idle comfort. Outside, an owl called through the darkness, and Margaret smiled at the sound that had frightened her just nights before. Tomorrow would bring new lessons and new challenges, but tonight she felt capable of meeting whatever came next. For the first time in her adult life, she was learning to depend on herself rather than on the goodwill and protection of others, and the independence was both frightening and exhilarating. She was no longer the helpless widow who had been bought for $3. She was becoming someone else entirely, someone stronger, more capable, and more connected to the essential business of living than she had ever imagined possible. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's arrival at the cabin, and the first frost of the season silvered the grass in the early morning light. She stood at the kitchen window, watching Ayana split firewood in the yard, his movements efficient and rhythmic as he prepared for the long winter ahead. The sight of him working no longer filled her with anxiety about her own helplessness. Instead, she found herself appreciating the careful way he approached each task, the respect he showed for the tools and materials that sustained their life together. Margaret had changed in ways that went far deeper than the calluses on her hands or the strength in her arms from weeks of physical labor. She could now milk Bella without assistance, collect eggs from even the most temperamental hens, and tend the fire through the night without letting it die. More importantly, she had begun to understand the rhythms of this life, the way each day's tasks connected to larger cycles of preparation and preservation, the satisfaction that came from work that produced immediate and visible results. But as the days grew shorter and colder, Margaret found herself facing questions she had been avoiding. Winter would require them to spend long hours together in the cabin's single room, depending entirely on each other for companionship and support. What had begun as a temporary arrangement born of desperation was becoming something more complex and emotionally fraught. She had grown to care for Ayana in ways that surprised and sometimes frightened her. His patience with her mistakes, his gentle humor, and his quiet strength had revealed qualities she had never known she valued in a man. Patrick had been charming and socially accomplished, but he had never shown her the steady reliability and inner peace that characterized Ayana's approach to life. More disturbing still, she had begun to notice the way her pulse quickened when Ayana's hand touched hers during their daily lessons, the way she found herself watching his face in the firelight during their evening conversations, the way his presence in the cabin made her feel safe and content in ways that had nothing to do with mere shelter. These feelings troubled her not only because they seemed like a betrayal of Patrick's memory, but because she was unsure how Ayana viewed their arrangement. He had been unfailingly kind and respectful, but he had also maintained a careful emotional distance that reminded her constantly that she was a guest in his home rather than a true partner in his life. The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted her thoughts, and she quickly turned away from the window as Ayana came through the door, bringing with him the scent of cold air and wood smoke. "The first snow will come soon," he said, setting down his axe and removing his leather jacket. "I can smell it in the air." Margaret poured him coffee from the pot that stayed warm on the edge of the fire, noting the way he cupped his hands around the mug to warm them. "Are we ready?" "As ready as we can be," Ayana replied. "The root cellar is full. There is meat preserved and stored, and we have enough firewood to last until spring. The chickens have extra bedding, and Bella's shelter is secure." The casual way he said, "we," made Margaret's heart skip, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. Over the weeks, they had fallen into patterns of shared responsibility that felt natural and comfortable, but she was never quite sure whether Ayana truly considered her a permanent part of his life or simply a temporary guest who happened to be useful. "I've been thinking," Margaret said carefully, settling in her chair by the fire with her own cup of coffee, "about what happens when spring comes." Ayana looked up from the harness he was mending, his expression unreadable. "What about spring? Whether I should start making plans to find somewhere else to live, to make a different arrangement." The silence that followed her words stretched uncomfortably long. Ayana set down his work and stared into the fire, his face thoughtful, but giving nothing away about his feelings. "Do you want to leave?" he asked finally. Margaret struggled to find the right words. "I want to stay, but only if you truly want me here. Not just because you feel obligated to honor the arrangement we made, or because it's convenient to have help with the work." Ayana stood and walked to the window, looking out at the forest where the first few snowflakes were beginning to drift down from the gray sky. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "Margaret, I need you to understand something. When I paid your debt in town, I thought I was performing a simple act of justice, preventing a wrong from being done to someone who deserved better. I expected you to stay for a few days, perhaps a week, until you could make other arrangements." Margaret felt her heart sink, though she tried not to let her disappointment show in her expression. But Ayana continued, turning back to face her. "What I did not expect was how much your presence would change this place for me. Not just the work you do, though that is valuable, but the way you listen when I speak, the questions you ask that make me think about familiar things in new ways, the sound of another person moving through rooms that have been silent for too long. He moved closer to the fire, but kept his distance from Margaret's chair. I also did not expect to care about you the way I have come to care. Not just as someone I was helping, but as someone whose happiness matters to me in ways that have nothing to do with obligation or charity. Margaret felt her breath catch. Ayana, let me finish, he said gently. I've been trying to be careful not to put pressure on you, not to make you feel that gratitude should be confused with affection. You've been through terrible losses and upheaval. The last thing I wanted was to take advantage of your vulnerability. Margaret stood and moved closer to him, close enough to see the uncertainty in his dark eyes despite the steadiness of his voice. What if it's not gratitude? She asked quietly. What if it's something else entirely? Ayana studied her face in the flickering firelight. Then, I would need to know that you're choosing freely, not from fear or loneliness or lack of other options. Margaret thought about his words, recognizing the wisdom in his caution. How could she be sure that her feelings were genuine when her entire life had been turned upside down? How could she know whether she cared for Ayana himself or simply for the security and peace she had found in his home? May I tell you what I've learned about myself these past weeks? She asked. Ayana nodded, settling back into his chair, but maintaining eye contact with her. I learned that I'm stronger than I thought, Margaret began, pacing slowly in front of the fireplace. I can work hard and learn new skills and support myself through my own efforts. I learned that I don't need elaborate social conventions or material comforts to be happy, that simple work and honest relationships matter more than anything I valued in my former life. She stopped and faced him directly. Most importantly, I learned that I had never really known what it meant to respect and trust a man until I met you. Patrick was exciting and charming, but he was also reckless and deceptive. He made promises he couldn't keep and hid important truths from me. You, on the other hand, have been honest about everything from the moment we met. You've kept every promise you've made, no matter how small. You've taught me skills that make me capable of caring for myself, instead of keeping me dependent on your protection. Ayana's expression had grown more intense as she spoke, but he remained silent, listening to her words with the same careful attention he gave to sounds in the forest that might indicate danger or opportunity. So when I say that I want to stay, Margaret continued, it's not because I'm afraid of being alone or because I don't have other choices. It's because this life we've built together, this partnership we've created, is the most honest and satisfying relationship I've ever had with another person. She took a deep breath before continuing. And when I say that I've come to care for you, it's not from gratitude or dependence, but from genuine admiration for who you are and how you live your life. Ayana stood slowly and crossed the space between them, stopping just close enough that Margaret could see the emotion in his eyes that he had been working so hard to keep controlled. Are you certain? He asked quietly. Because if we choose this path together, it will not be easy. There will be people in town who will never accept us, who will see our relationship as evidence of their worst fears and prejudices. There may be times when we face real danger because of their disapproval. Margaret reached out and took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his life of careful, honest work. I faced those people when they sold me on the courthouse steps for $3, she said. Their disapproval has already cost me everything I thought I wanted. What more can they take from me? They could take your life, Ayana sighed.